Thanks very much, everyone. It's always a bit daunting coming to something like this as a regulator, as a civil servant in your midst. It feels like this is like the mandatory part of your curriculum that you don't really want to go to, but you feel you should. So I'll try and make it as engaging as possible. For those of you who don't know us, the Competition Markets Authority, we are the main regulator that makes sure markets are working, that businesses compete fairly, and that consumers can trust the claims that they are seeing, that the adverts they're seeing. So just as an overview of what I'll go through today, just in terms of where we're coming from as the Competition and Markets Authority, I'll just touch briefly on what we've done in terms of our guidance on sustainability agreements. I think it's something that could be of real interest, certainly in a sector as complex as the fashion industry. I'll then talk us through the Green Claims Code. This hopefully you're all familiar with. It's something we published a few years ago that really sets out in broad terms what you should be thinking about when you're making claims about sustainability. Then I'll talk briefly about our fashion investigation and our international and other work. There's a lot to pack in, but I'll try and get through it fairly quickly, and hopefully there'll be time for questions at the end. Just to really sort of position where we are on this, this has been a key priority for the CMA for several years now. There's just a couple of quotes there to really show where we are sort of heading here, and this is going to stay one of our key priorities coming forward over the next few years. This is the piece of guidance that I wanted to talk to you briefly about. Most of what I'll be talking about is the consumer protection legislation side of stuff. But on the competition side, basically the Competition Act or the competition provisions that we enforce really regulate how businesses compete, that they don't start sharing data, they don't start setting prices, sharing markets, etc. But we recently published this guidance last year because we think it's vitally important. Businesses are going to have to come together, they are going to have to collaborate if they're going to achieve those sort of step changes in industries in terms of what they source, how they produce stuff. So basically the guidance briefly sets out what sort of things you need to avoid, what sort of agreements might well benefit from an exemption. And for the first time ever, we've invited businesses to just come and speak to us, to come and ask us if something that they are planning is likely to breach competition law. It's the first time we've ever done it. We've never offered advice like this before. So if you are thinking that you're going to need to collaborate with some of your competitors in order to achieve those sustainability benefits within the sector, then do come and speak to us, and there's the contact details. But this is the main thing I wanted to talk about today. We published back in September, now nearly 3 years ago, the Green Claims Code. It's basically guidance. It sets out law that's been around since 2008, but it's specifically designed to try and help people who are making claims about their environmental credentials, about sustainability. So we issued that back in September 2021, and 2 years ago, over 2 years, 2.5 years ago now, we launched the Fashion Compliance Review. We picked fashion because of the sheer volume of it. There's lots of reports on sort of mass pollution and stuff like that. So we wanted to really have a proper look at the sector to see what was going on. We then started investigating 3 brands back in July 2022, and earlier this year we secured undertakings which will form the basis of further guidance that will be issued in the next few months. And between that, we also launched a compliance review into the fast-moving consumer goods, household items, and we launched an investigation into Unilever last year. But the other thing I wanted to highlight there was the advice to government that we put in March 2022. It was so long ago, it was Kwasi Kwarteng was the business secretary at the time, so you can tell how far back it was. But there's some real clear advice into government there about really establishing what some key terms and phrases mean in the UK, and it would help businesses be much clearer on what they do. It would certainly help us as regulators to know exactly how people are using terms. But importantly, it would help consumers really understand when they see claims being made about certain things. So the Green Claims Code, hopefully some of you are familiar with it. Basically what we've tried to do is set out It's principles-based legislation, so it doesn't sort of say you can use this word, you can't use this. What it does say, it's broader, so it's all context-specific about where the claim is being made and how you're using certain phrases. So it sort of sets out claims must be truthful and accurate. Yep, we all know that. But also how they are presented can be unclear and unambiguous. They could be factually correct, but the way they're presented could imply something which actually isn't true. The other thing is, often we see claims about a particular part of a product or a process, but the reality is they're not saying everything else that's going on. So they may be choosing one particular component, but actually there has been improvements, there has been a benefit to the environment because they're using less water, less packaging or whatever, but the whole product actually, and you look at the whole process, and it's just such a tiny amount that really, is that claim true? Could a consumer really believe that? Other things, comparisons must be fair and meaningful. Also, they must be substantiated. We see so many claims out there where actually the business does not have the evidence to back up the claim. And what we're saying is you must have that evidence available. Doesn't mean you have to put that in every claim, but it does mean you have to have that evidence available to substantiate your claim before you make it. And the other thing is, consider the whole life cycle. Again, it doesn't mean you have to put the whole description of the product life cycle in the claim, but again, going back to that previous example I mentioned, it must be set within the overall context of the product. It can't just be, you can't just cherry pick one particular aspect of a product and imply that it is for the whole product. So just quickly going through what we did in the fashion sector. As I say, you don't need to, they're old figures anyway, but that was what we found, that's why we looked at it. A lot of people question why you're looking at fashion first, and also because it's such an enormous market that continues to evolve. We just heard from Jack about all of the things happening, and we just see it, we wanted to sort of step in and sort of say, hang on a minute, with all this development, with all this innovation, you need to consider how the consumer is absorbing all of this information and can they trust what you're telling them. So just briefly, what we went through, the process, we've actually got onto the least interesting part of the presentation now. But what I would say is this is sort of the necessary content that you really need to think about. When we accepted the undertakings from the 3 fashion brands earlier this year, those undertakings are set out on our website, and within there it sort of gives far more granular detail of the sort of things that you need to do. So like some of the statements are fairly obvious, specific and clear statements regarding fabric, but in terms of range criteria, it has to be absolutely clear that anything that the consumer finds through using filters or search words, that they find the products that they actually expect to get, because they will take a lot of that on what they've heard and the journey they've taken. They will therefore assume the product is sustainable. And if there are any caveats or anything around that, and that's not obvious from the journey they've taken, that could really mislead the consumer. The other thing we found was, because it's such a complex industry, we had no idea when we started looking at this. We're experts in consumer protection law. We are not experts in any given industry. And the sheer complexity of how products are sourced, through the fibers, through the garments, everything like that, we realized that in order to get the clarity for businesses about what we expected, we needed to actually set out in more detail in those undertakings exactly what processes and procedures probably needed to be in place in order to ensure that the business could confidently ensure it didn't make misleading claims in the future. So I would really encourage you to look at this when you've got time. What we are going to be doing, following on from that though, is setting out more guidance. Technically, it's not actually more guidance. What it is, while the Green Claims Code explains to businesses how the law applies to making environmental claims, what this additional bit of guidance will do is explain that in more detail for the fashion industry. So it's not new law, it's not new requirements. What it's doing is trying to set the Green Claims Code in the context of the fashion industry. So just quickly, I wanted to touch on what else is going on, because often what happens when we do something in the UK, we have the concerns, well, hang on a minute, are you making the UK a more difficult place to do business? It's just going to mean people are going to move elsewhere. It's going to make it more difficult for us to make claims in the UK. Just to really emphasize that we are part of this International Consumer Protection Enforcement Network. It's basically a group of agencies like the CMA, and we come together several times a year to discuss the issues that are of concern, where we need to sort of focus our joint efforts. And for the last 4 years, the CMA has been leading this project within this group, looking specifically at environmental claims. And every year, we're seeing more and more members coming on board. We've already got 22 agencies now working on this project every year. And every year, we're seeing it come up the list of key priority areas. So this is an area that is going to continue to attract regulators' attention going forward, not just in the UK, but globally. That's just sort of where we are focusing at the moment, some of the work that IcePen is concentrating on. There's some specific letters that we are working on with our colleagues in Norway, looking to send sort of an open letter. When we got the undertakings from the 3 fashion brands earlier this year, we sent out an open letter, which hopefully you're aware of, sort of setting out the requirements. Getting some nods, that's great. And what this is what we want to do is something similar on a global scale that will go out to all businesses to ensure that it's not just in the UK, businesses getting that message, but it's also globally. And also, often we get asked, yeah, but what about the ASA? What about the FCA? Who also issue guidance? Well, we have very regular meetings with the ASA, discussions, making sure that their guidance, our guidance align. So if you are complying with the ASA, then you are likely to be complying with our guidance as well. That's not necessarily the case. We have slightly different remits, but it's worth double checking. But we're trying to give you that assurance that any guidance we put out is consistent with what you will hear from the ASA. And the FCA sent out some guidance on their greenwashing rule a few months ago. And again, if you look at that, wording is virtually identical to what's in our guidance and what's in the ASA's guidance as well. And just quickly on the EU, obviously we're not in the EU anymore. We don't have to follow the EU directives, but the new ones coming out mean that businesses will have to take those into account. Anyone trading in Europe, selling goods into Europe or importing from Europe are going to have to comply with those directives. And what we want to make sure we do is to ensure that our guidance, what we're doing here, doesn't conflict then with what the expectations are coming out from the EU, because that's going to make it incredibly difficult for you. So what I want to leave you with is that reassurance that we are doing as much as we can to ensure that the messaging you are getting from us, from our international partners, from our UK colleagues, is as consistent as possible, and that you have as clear guidance as we can put out there to try and help you comply with the law. And one thing I almost forgot. The law hasn't changed since 2008 in what is required in terms of misleading statements and what you need to do to comply with consumer law. However, there is a new act in town, the Digital Markets Competition and Consumer Act. It received royal assent, I think, the day after the election was called, just missed the pre-election period. And we expect the consumer protection elements to come in probably next year, probably April. And what it will do is enable us to make a decision on whether or not a business has breached the law. At the moment, we have to go to court, and it's for a court to decide. But what we will be able to do is say, no, the business has breached the law, and we would be able to impose fines on those businesses. It brings our consumer protection powers in line with our competition powers. And there are further penalties as well if people refuse to comply with an information notice or something like that. So that's no threat, but it's a reality that people are taking this sort of thing much more seriously. The government clearly thinks that we need stronger powers in order to ensure that people are not making misleading claims and that consumers can trust what they're hearing. That is a quick rattle through, 25 minutes. Hopefully that's in time. Hopefully that was of interest as well as sort of necessary. But happy to take any questions that you've got if there's time. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for a really thorough presentation. I work for a company which is a vendor management and compliance tool helping brands worldwide have the right kind of data to back up, for example, sustainability claims. I'd love to know how aligned or what the plans are to be able to align with CSRD reporting, corporate sustainable due diligence reporting.
Yeah, no, again, and this is where our discussions with the ASA, with the FCA in particular, come in, and we're making sure that what we are requiring of business, it shouldn't sort of misalign, and it shouldn't contradict what those requirements are there. But one thing I would add is that whilst the ASA deal only with adverts and advertisements, we can look at the whole consumer journey. So those corporate claims and how people are sort of advertising their own brand, even though it's not product specific, as part of the consumer journey. And so we will look at that whole thing. Now, obviously, when we're looking at that, we will be aware of what those reporting requirements are elsewhere. So we are aware of that. It shouldn't contradict, but where it does, we would look to, first of all, look to see, well, what is a business required to do elsewhere through law, and then how is that presented to the consumer? Ultimately, that's what we care about. It's not whether or not you've ticked that box or not that one. It's what's the overall impression to the consumer, and how is a business conveying all of that picture around who they are, what they produce, how they manufacture, and how they're presenting that to the consumer.
And is there a plan for the CMA to also be aligned with digital? Hello, sorry. I was wondering if there's a plan for CMA to also have some input, or what's the agenda for digital product passport? Of course, in Europe, these conversations are a bit more advanced. But I'm just wondering, from the UK perspective.
Yeah, that's not something that we've looked at yet. Again, it will be in that overall context. From our perspective, it's how is all that information being conveyed to the consumer? But clearly it's something that we need to keep up to date with in terms of what's going on there. And that is really exciting, because I think it's there that businesses can start evidencing much more easily the sourcing of the information. I mean, that's the holy grail, isn't it? Being able to track something from source to the consumer, and you can say, hand on heart, we know exactly where this has come from, and how sustainable it is. And that's the holy grail we all want to see. I mean, and I go back to our competition guidance. We really want to help you do this. That's why we're putting the guidance out there. It's why we do. But people only tend to listen to us when we take enforcement action, unfortunately. So, but we will keep putting out the guidance there. And if you have got any ideas, any thoughts that we should be taking on board, then please let us know.
Thank you.